Hello and welcome to our discussion of natural law theory. Here we're going to be looking at the second part where we're going to focus on the principle of double effect. The principle of double effect is the form of decision making that this theory utilizes. Now, before we do that, let's remind ourselves what the theory in a nutshell says. Our conception of the right states that an action is right if and only if failing to do it would result in a direct violation of one or more basic goods. Those goods being life, procreation, knowledge, and sociability. Now recall that we've yet to actually derive this particular form of our conception of the right. To this point at least, we've only talked about that we should promote right and wrong, that we should promote these basic goods, and that trying to act to destroy or hinder them would ultimately be morally wrong. Now if you also recall, we're at the point now to where we need to ask questions about moral conflict. If we're going to be in a situation, if we find ourselves in situations whereby these values come into conflict in some way, we need to have a better idea of how we move forward so that we can make a decision which ultimately is a moral decision. Now, one thing I'd like for you to view before you go further is this video from YouTube about Texas castle law. This involves a situation that occurred in Houston in 2008, if I recall correctly. It's a really important video that tells us a lot about what can happen in situations where maybe a good thing could occur, but also a bad thing. From this, we can look at, for example, our question about self-defense. Timmons writes, suppose that in order to preserve one's own life against an unjust aggressor, one must kill the assailant. There just is no other way. In this sort of kill or be killed situation, may one kill in self-defense? The natural law theory requires that we promote and maintain the basic goods, one of which is human life. Since in the situation imagined, the only way of protecting one's own life is by the taking the life of another human being, the theory yields the conclusion that we ought to take the life in question. But on the other hand, the natural law theory tells us that we are to avoid bringing about evil. And since intentionally taking the life of a human being is an evil, the theory apparently yields the conclusion that we ought not to kill the assailant. So the natural law theory, as so far explained, yields the contradictory moral conclusion that we ought to kill the assailant and that we ought not to kill the assailant. We come across our moral dilemmas in which we have factors that may tell us that we should do something and factors that tell us that we shouldn't do something. Another classic example that Timmons discusses is in the case of a woman who might need to undergo a hysterectomy. Let's suppose in this situation that this woman is in the early stages of pregnancy, and that in the early stages of pregnancy, through these routine examinations, that they also discover that she has uterine cancer. The only way to save her life is to ultimately engage in an abortion. That is, that the fetus will die. According to the theory, we're in a contradictory position. But we need to figure out a way how we can try to understand and move through these situations to develop a clear moral verdict. The principle of double effect is going to have three primary facets to it. Ultimately, it's going to base a lot of itself, that is, a lot of the decision making, based on intention. That is, that the reason why we're engaging in a certain act matters. This requires us to look at what an agent intends to do, as well as the reasonable consequences of our actions. So we need to understand what we're looking to gain and what could happen as we try to gain that. Sometimes, again, good effects and bad effects. We therefore need to have a way of trying to work our way through this. And that's what this principle allows us to do. Our first situation here is that we're going to ask the question of, is the action itself, apart from its effects, wrong? When an action would have both a good effect and a bad effect, we can only perform the action if we can meet all three of these criteria. Again, our first criteria is this question about moral absolutism. That is, certain actions, according to this theory, are inherently wrong no matter what. Ideas or things such as this include, for example, it's intentionally wrong to kill human beings. It's wrong to lie. It's wrong to engage in adultery. It's wrong to engage in homosexual behavior. Actions such as these, if these are the action that we're looking at, by this theory are defined as being absolutely wrong, that there is no way how these things could be right. But let's say that our action in itself is not necessarily wrong. So we would then move to step 2. In step 2, the bad effect must not be intended by the agent. And there are 2 ways how we can intend an action. First, the effect can be the chosen end of action. So that as we look at the goal itself, is the bad effect our goal? If the goal is our bad effect, we don't pass go. We don't get $200 and we stop here by saying that our action that we intend is morally impermissible. But the other way how we can intend an action is if we intend the bad effects as a means for bringing about an action. As I've written here, any effect that is a means for bringing about some intended end is also intended. So let's say that my intended goal is to get a piece of pie. Now, the piece of pie itself may not be a wrong action. But let's say that in order for me to get this piece of pie, I'm going to rob a store. Well, my robbing of a store may be a wrong action. For example, it may violate, say, for example, principle of sociality. By my intending a bad effect, I've intended something which is not permissible. Therefore, I could stop here at this point. But let's say that thus far my action is not absolutely wrong. I'm intending a good effect, and I'm not intending bad effects as a way of bringing about an action. I then move to step 3. The bad effect must not be out of proportion to the good effect. Now, there's something very important that we need to understand here. Because of the thesis of incommensurability, as discussed in our last session, we cannot measure the degrees of goodness or badness according to the same scale of measurement. That is, that I don't have a way of comparing, say, plus or minus quantities of life to plus or minus quantities of knowledge. They just don't work in comparing apples and oranges. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't develop some type of rational comparison and judge how things come out. I just can't develop a way in which I'm using some type of commensurable status or process to do so. So again, let's look at the question of, say, is my action of self-defense in itself wrong? Well, the action may not be. I'm intending to defend myself. I then come to the intention. Now, if my intending to kill somebody, for example, via self-defense. Well, if my intention is to kill somebody, well, in that situation, my action may be wrong because I've intended as a means for bringing about my act. That is, my act of self-defense. So we may be able to say that in certain forms of self-defense, for example, in forms of lethal self-defense, if the lethality is intended, that particular action may not be morally permissible according to the principle of double effect. But let's say that I'm not intending lethal actions, and that I don't anticipate that my actions could be lethal. So let's say, for example, that I'm using some type of non-lethal form of self-defense, say punching, kicking, or something like that, something that's traditionally and typically non-lethal. Well, in that situation, even though I may harm the health of the other person through my act of self-defense, it may be permissible for me to do so. And then if I get to this third stage, that is the harm to the other person's health at proportion to the good effect? The good effect being, again, self-defense, overall safety. Well, if I'm not intending, again, to harm a person significantly, if I'm using proper restraint and so forth in my own actions, then I may be able to say that my act of self-defense is in proportion to the potential bad effect. Therefore, it may be self-defense, and may be justifiable, that is. Now again, key to this is this idea of moral absolutism. Remember that certain actions are absolutely wrong. They cannot be justified. And notice here, again, the question of intentionality is remarkably important. We cannot intentionally kill another person, lie, commit adultery, homosexual behavior, and so forth, according to this theory. Now, taking this into consideration, we now need to revise our theory of the right. We're going to say that an action that directly violates a basic value, and an action basically violates that basic value if and only if, one, the action will bring about the hindrance or destruction of a basic value, and two, if that action cannot be justified via the PDE. This brings us to our second form of right conduct. An action A is obligatory if and only if failing to perform it would result in a direct violation of one or more basic goods.